The orc woman stood in the doorway of the millwright's office with her cap in her hands and her shoulders squared against rejection. And Dalton Emrick looked up from his ledger to see green skin and small tusks and tired, honest eyes that expected nothing from him but another closed door. He did not close it. "The work is hard," he said instead, his voice carrying the gravel of a man who had spent 30 winters fixing what water broke. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The mill race is destroyed. Half the gears need replacing. The water wheel shaft is cracked through. I can pay 2 silver a week plus meals until we are grinding again, then 4 silver after that. The orc woman blinked, and Dalton watched her process the fact that he had not asked her to leave. She was perhaps 5.5 feet tall, built like someone who had spent years doing real work, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and clothes that had been mended more than once. Her green skin was darker along her forearms where the sun had touched it, and her tusks were small enough that they barely showed past her upper lip. "I can do hard work," she said, and her voice was steady. "I have done carpentry, stonework, fieldwork. I do not steal. I do not drink. I want honest pay for honest labor." "The others who came," Dalton said, watching her carefully, "they wanted to negotiate, said I should pay half now and half later, or that 2 silver was too little for such dangerous work, or that they needed 3 days off each week for other obligations." He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "You are the first one who did not try to bargain down a desperate man." She met his eyes, and he saw something there that he recognized, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been turned away too many times to waste energy on false hope. "I need the work," she said simply. "If you are offering it, I will take it." Dalton stood, unfolding his full 6 feet and feeling the familiar ache in his lower back that had been his companion since the flood waters had receded and left his mill in ruins. "What is your name?" "Reva Ruskin," she said, and then, as if she could not help herself, "I know what people say about orcs. I will not cause trouble. I will do the work and keep to myself." "I am Dalton Emrick," he replied, and extended his hand across the desk. "The work starts tomorrow at dawn. There is a room above the mill that is dry and has a stove. You can stay there." Reva stared at his hand for a long moment, and Dalton saw the disbelief flicker across her face before she reached out and took it. Her grip was firm and her palm was calloused, and he thought that perhaps this would work after all. The next morning she arrived before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, and Dalton was already standing beside the ruined mill race with a shovel in his hands and a plan in his head that would take months to execute. The flood had come down from the mountains 3 weeks prior, a wall of water and debris that had torn through the valley and destroyed everything he had spent 15 years building. The water wheel was gone entirely, ripped from its mount and carried downstream. The mill race was choked with mud and broken trees. The building itself had survived, but the gears inside were ruined, and the great grinding stones had shifted on their foundation. "We start with the race," Dalton said without preamble, handing her a shovel. "Clear the mud and debris. Dig down to the original stone, then we rebuild the walls and the channel." He pointed downstream where the water now ran wild and useless. "After that, we build a new wheel, then we fix the gears, then we level the stones, then we grind." Reva took the shovel and looked at the destruction, and Dalton saw her shoulders settle in the way of someone preparing for a long battle. "How long?" she asked. 3 months if we are lucky," Dalton said. 4 if we are not." "Then we should start," Reva said, and she walked down into the muck and began to dig. They worked in silence that first day, the kind of silence that belonged to people who were used to being alone with their thoughts. Dalton watched her from the corner of his eye as they shoveled mud and hauled broken branches, and he saw that she knew how to pace herself, how to lift without straining her back, how to read the way water had flowed through the destruction and anticipate where the worst damage would be. She did not complain when the mud sucked at her boots or when the sun grew hot overhead. She did not ask for breaks. She did not need or try to fill the air with meaningless conversation. At midday, he brought out bread and cheese and cold ale, and they sat on the bank eating in companionable quiet while the stream rushed past them, indifferent to their labor. "You said you were a widower," Reva said after a while, and Dalton realized he must have mentioned it when the first laborers had come asking about sleeping arrangements. "5 years now," Dalton replied, tearing off a piece of bread and chewing it slowly. "Fever took her the winter after our daughter was born. The daughter went with my wife's sister to the coast, better opportunities there." He did not say that he had not fought to keep the girl, that he had been drowning in grief and work, and had let her go because he could not imagine raising a child alone. He did not say that he sent money every month and received polite letters twice a year that told him nothing real about who his daughter was becoming. Reva nodded and did not press, and Dalton was grateful for that. "And you?" he asked, because it seemed fair to offer the same opening. "No husband," Reva said, brushing crumbs from her hands. "No family that claims me. I have been working where I can find it, moving when people decide they do not want an orc nearby." She said it without bitterness, just as a statement of fact, the way someone might comment on the weather. "You will not have to move from here," Dalton said, and he meant it. "Not if the work is good." Something shifted in her expression, something small and cautious that might have been hope, and she nodded once before returning to her meal. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as steady as the turn of mill gears. They rose with the dawn and worked until dusk, stopping only for brief meals and water. The mill race slowly emerged from the mud, its stone walls cracked but intact, and they began the careful work of repairing the mortar and rebuilding the sections that had collapsed entirely. Reva proved to be as good as her word. She knew how to mix mortar to the right consistency, how to set stones so they would hold against the current, how to brace timber so it would not warp. Dalton found himself relaxing into the work in a way he had not expected. After the flood, he had spent 2 weeks staring at the ruins and feeling the weight of starting over pressing down on him like a physical thing. He was 43 years old, and the thought of rebuilding alone had seemed impossible. But with Reva working beside him, the impossible began to feel merely difficult, and difficult was something he knew how to handle. They did not talk much during those first weeks. Dalton was not a man given to idle chatter, and Reva seemed to prefer action over words. But small exchanges crept in, regardless instructions about measurements, observations about the weather, brief questions about technique. Dalton learned that Reva had apprenticed with a carpenter in a town 2 valleys over before the carpenter's neighbors had made it clear that an orc was not welcome. She had worked on a road crew after that, then a barn raising, then as a field hand during harvest. Always moving, always alone, always expendable. Why stay in human lands? Dalton asked one evening as they cleaned their tools before the light failed. There must be orc settlements that would take you in. Reva paused in oiling her hammer, and her expression grew distant. "I was born in human lands," she said quietly. "My mother worked in a tannery, my father on the docks. They are both gone now. I do not know the orc ways, do not speak the orc tongue beyond a few words. To them I would be as foreign as I am here." She resumed her work, her movements precise. "At least here I know what to expect." Dalton thought about that as he wrapped his saws in oilcloth and stored them in the tool shed. He thought about what it meant to belong nowhere, to be always on the outside looking in, and he thought about his own loneliness, which was different but perhaps not entirely dissimilar. He had lived his whole life in this valley, knew every family and every field, but after his wife's death, he had withdrawn into his work and his grief until the connections had withered. People bought their grain and paid their fees and went away again, and Dalton had told himself he preferred it that way. Looking at Reva now, he was not so sure. The room above the mill was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a table and a stove that worked well enough. Dalton had cleared it out after his wife died, unable to bear living in the house they had shared, and he had made the mill his home in all the ways that mattered. His own quarters were on the ground floor, a larger room with a proper bed and a shelf for his books and a window that looked out over the stream. He took his meals alone, usually bread and cheese, sometimes soup or porridge, whatever required minimal effort. But with Reva working alongside him, it seemed foolish to eat separately, and so he began cooking for two. He discovered that she had a weakness for honey cakes, and that she ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had known hunger. He discovered that she would try anything he put in front of her, and that she had strong opinions about pepper, which she liked in quantities that made his eyes water. In return, she began helping with the cooking, and he discovered that she knew how to make a stew sing with just a handful of herbs, and that she could bake bread that was better than anything he had managed in years. "My mother taught me," she said when he complimented the loaf, and there was a softness in her voice that he had not heard before. She said that being able to feed yourself well was a kind of wealth that no one could take away. They ate that bread with butter and strawberry preserves, and Dalton thought it might be the best meal he had eaten in 5 years. The mill race was finished by the end of the 6th week, and they stood together looking at the clean channel, and the rebuilt walls and the water flowing smoothly through it once more. It was not yet doing any work. The water wheel still needed to be built. The gears still needed to be installed, but it was progress, visible and real. And Dalton felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the flood. "Good work," he said, and Reva nodded, her face betraying no pride but her shoulders straightening just slightly. "What next?" she asked, already looking toward the mill building where the real complexity waited. "The wheel," Dalton said. "I have the plans drawn up. It will take both of us to build it, and it will take time." Time they had, as it turned out, and they spent the next month working on the great wheel that would turn the gears and drive the stones. They cut timber from the forest upstream, hauling it to the mill on a borrowed cart. They shaped the paddles and the axle, fitted the joints, tested the balance. It was exacting work, the kind that left no room for error, and Dalton found himself relying on Reva's eye for measurement and her steady hands. She was better at carpentry than he was, if he was honest. His skills ran to stone and metalwork, to the practical engineering of gears and shafts. But Reva could look at a piece of wood and see what it wanted to be, could shape it with a few precise cuts and make it fit as if it had been born to that purpose. He told her so one afternoon when she finished a particularly tricky joint, and she ducked her head in a way that he was beginning to recognize as pleased. "It is what I am good at," she said simply. "I like making things fit together." "So do I," Dalton replied, and meant it in more ways than one. The wheel was finished in late summer, and they mounted it together with the help of a block and tackle, and several hours of careful maneuvering. When it was finally in place and they opened the sluice gate, the water hit the paddles with a rush, and the wheel began to turn, slowly at first and then with gathering momentum, the great shaft rotating smoothly in its bearings. Dalton stood beside Reva and watched it turn, and he felt something in his chest that might have been joy. "It works," Reva said, and there was wonder in her voice. "It works," Dalton agreed, and for a moment they simply stood there, side by side, watching the fruit of their labor. That night, Dalton cooked a proper dinner: roast chicken and potatoes and carrots from the garden, with apple tart for dessert. They ate in his quarters because there was more room, and Reva sat across from him at the table and ate with an appetite that made him glad he had cooked enough for three. "The gear's next," he said as they finished the meal, pushing back from the table with a satisfied sigh. "That will be the hardest part. Some of them can be repaired, but the main drive gear needs to be recast entirely. I will need to go to the foundry in town, and that will take money I do not quite have yet." "How much?" Reva asked, and when he told her she frowned. "Is there no way to do it cheaper?" "Not if we want it to last," Dalton said. "A mill gear takes a beating. It needs to be solid iron, properly weighted, perfectly balanced. If we cut corners there, the whole thing will shake itself apart within a year." Reva nodded slowly, and he could see her thinking. "How long until you have the money?" "Another month," Dalton said. "Maybe 6 weeks. People owe me for grinding from before the flood, and they will pay when the harvest comes in. Until then, we wait." But the waiting turned out to be shorter than expected, because 3 days later a man from the next valley over arrived with a cart full of grain and a desperate need for milling. His own mill had been closed for repairs, and he had heard that Emrick's mill might be up and running soon. "It is not," Dalton said honestly, showing the man the empty gear housing and the grinding stones that still sat askew on their foundation. "Another month at least, maybe more." The man's face fell, and Dalton saw the panic there: a farmer with grain and no way to mill it, with winter coming and a family to feed. "I will pay double," the man said. "I will pay whatever you ask. I just need the grain milled." Dalton shook his head. "I cannot mill what I do not have the equipment for. I am sorry." But Reva had been listening, and after the man left she came to Dalton with an idea. "What if we mill it by hand?" she said. "With a quern stone. It would take days, but we could do it." Dalton stared at her. "Do you know how much grain he has? It would take a week of constant work, maybe more." "So we work," Reva said. "He will pay double, you said. That is enough for the gear and then some, and it is honest work." Dalton thought about it, thought about the grinding monotony of hand milling, the ache in the arms and back, the sheer tedium of it. Then he thought about the gear sitting in the foundry waiting for money he did not have, and he nodded. They sent word to the farmer, and he returned the next day with his grain and a look of profound relief. Dalton brought out the old quern stones from storage, the kind that had not been used since his grandfather's time, and he and Reva set to work. It was brutal labor, the kind that made the previous week seem easy by comparison. They took turns cranking the stones, grinding the grain into flour in small batches, over and over and over. Their hands blistered and their backs ached, and the monotony of it was mind-numbing. But they worked, hour after hour, stopping only to eat and sleep and then starting again. The farmer came by on the 3rd day and looked at them with something like awe. "You are really doing it," he said, and Dalton just grunted and kept cranking. Reva, who was resting between shifts, smiled tiredly. "We said we would." "I know," but the farmer shook his head. "Most would have turned me away or told me to wait. You are good people." After he left, Dalton glanced at Reva and saw that she was looking at her hands, at the fresh blisters forming over old calluses. "Do you think that is true?" she asked quietly. "That we are good people?" "I think we are people who do what we say we will do," Dalton replied, flexing his own aching fingers. "That is good enough for me." They finished the job on the 7th day, and the farmer paid them in silver and gratitude and a wheel of cheese from his wife. Dalton counted out the coins and found that it was indeed enough for the gear and a bit extra besides. He split the extra evenly between himself and Reva, and when she tried to protest he held up a hand. "You earned it," he said. "More than earned it. Without you we could not have done this at all." Reva took the coins and looked at them for a long moment, and Dalton saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "Thank you," she said, and there was a weight of meaning in those two words that went beyond the money. "Thank you," Dalton replied, and meant it just as deeply. With the money in hand, Dalton went to the foundry and ordered the gear. It would take 2 weeks to cast and cool, the foundry master said, and Dalton paid half up front and arranged to pay the rest on delivery. In the meantime, he and Reva turned their attention to the other gears, cleaning and repairing the ones that could be salvaged, fabricating new teeth for the ones that were too worn. It was during this work that Dalton began to notice the small things. He noticed the way Reva hummed while she worked, a tuneless melody that seemed to help her focus. He noticed that she always hung her tools in the same order, handles facing left, blades clean. He noticed that she took her tea with milk but no sugar, and that she liked to watch the sunrise from the window of her room above the mill. He noticed that, when she smiled, which was rare but becoming less so, her whole face changed, and the guardedness that usually lived in her eyes softened into something approaching peace. And he noticed that he had started looking forward to their meals together, to the quiet conversations that had begun to develop, to the comfortable silence that fell when words were not needed. It crept up on him slowly, the realization that his life had become something different than it had been. The work was still hard, the days still long, but there was a warmth to them now that had been missing for years. He had stopped eating alone. He had stopped working in silence. He had stopped living in the narrow space between waking and sleeping, and had started, without quite meaning to, living again. Reva must have noticed something too, because one evening as they cleaned up after dinner, she paused with a dish in her hands and looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "What is it?" Dalton asked, setting down his own plate. "I have been here almost 3 months," she said slowly, as if testing the words. "Longer than I have stayed anywhere in years. I keep thinking you will tell me to leave, or that the work will run out, or that something will change." She set the dish down carefully. "But it has not." "Do you want it to change?" Dalton asked, and his heart was beating harder than it should have been. "No," Reva said, meeting his eyes. "I do not want it to change at all." "Then it will not," Dalton said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. That night, alone in his room, Dalton stood looking at the chest of drawers beside his bed. It was a simple piece, oak with brass handles, 4 drawers in total. The top drawer held his socks and small clothes. The second drawer held his shirts. The third was for trousers and work clothes. The fourth had been his wife's once, and after she died he had emptied it and left it empty, unable to fill it with his own things, unable to give it away. Now, standing in the lamplight, he pulled open that 4th drawer and looked at the empty space inside. He thought about Reva living above the mill, her few belongings packed in a canvas bag, always ready to move on. He thought about what she had said about staying, about not wanting things to change. And he thought about the fact that he did not want her to leave, not now and not ever, and that the feeling terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Slowly, carefully, he cleaned out the drawer, wiping away dust and smoothing the lining. He left it open, ready, and went to bed with his mind spinning. The next day he said nothing about the drawer. The day after that, nothing still. But the space sat in his mind like a seed waiting to sprout, and he found himself thinking about it at odd moments while fitting a gear tooth, while kneading bread, while lying awake in the dark. The gear arrived from the foundry right on schedule, and it took both of them plus a hired carter to get it into position. It was a beautiful piece of work, the teeth perfectly cast, the weight precisely balanced. They mounted it on the main shaft and connected it to the water wheel's drive, and when they tested it, the whole mechanism turned with a smoothness that made Dalton's breath catch. "That is a good sound," Reva said, listening to the mesh of gear teeth, and Dalton nodded. "That is the sound of success," he replied. With the gears in place, only the grinding stones remained. They had been knocked askew by the flood, and leveling them was work that required patience and precision. Too high and the flour would be coarse. Too low, and the stones would grind themselves to dust. Dalton had a spirit level and years of experience, and Reva had strong hands and a good eye, and together they shimmed and adjusted until the stones sat perfectly horizontal, perfectly balanced. When it was done, when every component had been checked and rechecked, Dalton loaded a sack of grain into the hopper and opened the sluice gate. The water wheel turned. The gears engaged. The stones began to rotate, and grain began to flow into the eye of the upper stone and emerge from the edge as flour, pale and fine and perfect. Reva laughed, a sound of pure delight, and Dalton felt his own face split into a grin he could not contain. They had done it. They had taken a ruin and made it whole again, and the mill was alive once more, ready to serve the valley through the coming harvest. "We should celebrate," Dalton said impulsively, and Reva looked at him with surprise. "Celebrate how?" "Dinner," Dalton said. "A real dinner. I will cook something special, and we will open the bottle of wine I have been saving." That evening he made a roast with all the trimmings, and they sat across from each other at the table in his quarters with the lamp burning warm and the wine glowing red in their glasses. They talked about the work, about the satisfaction of seeing the mill running again, about the harvest that would soon be starting and the grain that would need milling. And then, as the meal wound down and the wine loosened his tongue, Dalton found himself talking about his wife, about the life they had planned and the years they had lost, about his daughter growing up on the coast without him. "You ever think about going to see her?" Reva asked gently. "All the time," Dalton admitted. "But what would I say? I am a stranger to her now. She has a life there, a good life. I do not want to disrupt that." "You are her father," Reva said. "That matters." "Does it?" Dalton asked, and the question was rower than he intended. "I sent her away. I chose the mill over her. What kind of father does that make me?" Reva reached across the table and put her hand over his, and the touch was warm and solid and grounding. "The kind who was grieving and did what he thought was best," she said quietly. "The kind who sends money every month to make sure she is cared for. The kind who keeps her letters even if they do not say much." She paused. "You are not as alone as you think you are, Dalton, and neither is she." Dalton looked at their hands, green on weathered tan, and felt something shift inside him, something he had been holding at bay without quite acknowledging it. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice rough. "You said you have no family. Is that how you want it to stay?" Reva's fingers tightened around his, and when she spoke her voice was barely above a whisper. "No," she said, "that is not how I want it to stay." They sat there for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, and Dalton felt the weight of all the things he could not quite say pressing against his ribs. He was not a man of poetry or grand gestures. He did not know how to speak the language of romance, did not have the words to express the way his chest tightened when she smiled, or the way he had started waking up looking forward to the day, because it meant seeing her. But he knew how to show what he felt, knew how to build something solid and real with his hands. And so, that night, he did something that he hoped would speak louder than words. The next morning, Reva came down from her room above the mill and found Dalton already up, waiting. He had breakfast laid out, eggs and bacon and fresh bread, and the look on his face was one she had not seen before, nervous and hopeful in equal measure. "I need to show you something," he said, and led her through to his quarters. She followed, curious and a little uncertain, and when he gestured to the open drawer beside his bed, she looked at it and then at him, confusion clear on her face. "I cleared it out," Dalton said, the words coming out more awkward than he wanted. "For you, if you want it. If you want to move your things down here." He swallowed hard. "If you want to stay." Reva stared at the drawer, and Dalton watched as understanding dawned in her eyes. It was not a proposal, not exactly. It was something quieter and more profound than that, an offer of permanence, of home, of a place beside him that was hers by right and not by sufferance. "You want me to stay," she said slowly, as if testing the reality of it. "Not just for the work, for this, for us." "Yes," Dalton said, and the word felt like the most important one he had ever spoken. "I want you to stay. I want to wake up and see you every morning. I want to cook meals together and work together and build a life together." He took a breath. "I am not good with words, Reva. But I am good with actions, and this is me telling you the best way I know how that you belong here, with me." Reva's eyes were bright, and when she reached out to touch the drawer, her hand trembled slightly. "I have never belonged anywhere," she said, her voice thick. "I have never had someone want me to stay." "I want you to stay," Dalton repeated, and he stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "If you will have me." Reva looked at him, really looked at him, and then she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was gentle and fierce all at once, a kiss that tasted of hope and longing and the slow burn of feelings that had been building for months. Dalton wrapped his arms around her and felt her solid warmth against him, felt the way she fit against his chest as if she had always been meant to be there. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Reva rested her forehead against his and smiled. "I will stay," she said. "I will stay for as long as you will have me." "Forever, then," Dalton said, and kissed her again. That day they moved her belongings down from the room above the mill. There was not much a change of clothes, a blanket her mother had made, a small wooden box containing letters and keepsakes. But when her things were settled in the drawer beside his bed, when her blanket was folded at the foot of their bed, and her boots stood beside his by the door, Dalton felt something settle in his soul that had been restless for longer than he could remember. They fell into a new rhythm after that, one that was both familiar and strange. They still worked together, still rose at dawn and labored through the day. But now there was a tenderness woven through the work, a awareness of each other that had not been there before. Dalton found himself reaching for her hand as they walked, or brushing a kiss against her temple as he passed. Reva would lean against him while they ate, or rest her head on his shoulder in the evening, and each small touch felt like a gift. The harvest came, and with it the rush of work they had been preparing for. Farmers arrived with their grain, cart after cart of wheat and barley and rye, and the mill ran from dawn until well past dark. Dalton and Reva worked in shifts, one managing the mill while the other handled the customers, and the rhythm of it was grueling but satisfying. Word spread through the valley that Emrick's mill was running again, and running well. The flour was fine and consistent, the weights honest, the service reliable. People came from farther and farther away, and Dalton found himself turning away work because they simply did not have the hours to take it all. It should have been a time of uncomplicated success. But success, as Dalton had learned, bred its own problems. The first sign of trouble came in the form of Tobias Reed, the owner of the other mill in the valley, the one that had been closed for repairs when the desperate farmer had come to Dalton. Reed's mill had reopened a week after Dalton's, and he had clearly expected to reclaim his customers without difficulty. Instead, he found that many of them had gone to Emrick's mill and liked what they found there. Reed was a man of middle years with a prosperous belly and an ego to match, and he did not take kindly to competition. He came to the mill one afternoon while Dalton was overseeing a batch, and Reva was outside loading flour sacks onto a customer's cart. "Emrick," Reed said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man who wanted something. "Congratulations on getting your mill running again. I heard the flood damage was extensive." "It was," Dalton said, not taking his eyes off the hopper, "but we managed." "So I see." Reed rocked back on his heels, surveying the operation with a critical eye. "I also see you have taken on some unusual help." Dalton's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Reva is an excellent worker, best I have ever had." "I am sure she is capable," Reed said smoothly. "But you must understand how it looks. An orc working in a mill, handling the grain that people will eat." He shook his head with false concern. "People are talking, Emrick. They are wondering if it is safe." "The grain is safe," Dalton said flatly. "The flour is clean and properly milled. Anyone who has concerns is welcome to watch the process themselves." I am sure," Reed said, waving a hand dismissively. "But you know how people are. They hear things, they worry, and worry is bad for business." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "It would be a shame if those worries cost you customers." Dalton turned to face Reed fully, and there must have been something in his expression that made the other man take a step back. "Are you threatening me?" Dalton asked quietly. "Threatening?" "No, no." Reed spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "I am simply pointing out the reality of the situation. People have choices about where to take their grain, and if they start to believe that one mill is questionable, well, they will take their business elsewhere." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "I would hate to see you lose everything you worked so hard to rebuild." "Get out," Dalton said, his voice cold as winter stone. "And do not come back unless you have grain that needs milling." Reed's smile faltered, and for a moment his face showed naked anger before he smoothed it away. "You are making a mistake, Emrick," he said, "but I suppose you will learn that in time." He turned and walked out, leaving Dalton standing beside the grinding stones with his hands clenched into fists. Reva came in a few minutes later and found him still standing there, staring at nothing. "What is wrong?" she asked, and Dalton realized she must have seen Reed leave. He told her about the conversation, watching her face as he spoke. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished her expression was carefully neutral. "He is going to spread rumors," she said quietly, "about me, about the mill." "Yes," Dalton agreed, "I think he is." "You could fire me," Reva said, and though her voice was steady, Dalton could hear the pain underneath it. "Send me away before it costs you everything." Dalton crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands in his. "I will not," he said fiercely. "I will not send you away. Not for him, not for anyone. We built this together, Reva. We will face this together too." "But if it ruins you, then it ruins me," Dalton interrupted. "But I will not betray you to save my business. I will not become the kind of man who throws away someone he loves because it is convenient." Reva's breath caught and her eyes went wide. "Loves?" she repeated as if she had not heard correctly. Dalton realized what he had said, and instead of taking it back, he doubled down. "Yes," he said firmly. "I love you, Reva Ruskin. I should have said it sooner. I love your strength and your skill and the way you hum when you work. I love your honesty and your courage and the way you make my life better just by being in it." He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "So no, I will not send you away, not ever." Reva pulled her hands free and threw her arms around his neck, and when she kissed him there were tears on her cheeks. "I love you too," she said against his mouth. "I love you so much it scares me." They held each other there in the mill, surrounded by the smell of flour and the sound of rushing water, and Dalton thought that whatever Reed tried to do to them, it would not break this. They were stronger together than any rumor or threat could diminish. But Reed proved to be more persistent than Dalton had anticipated. Over the next week, business began to slow. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Farmers who had been regular customers started making excuses about why they needed to go elsewhere. Some claimed Reed was offering better prices. Others said his mill was closer, or that they had old ties to his family. But Dalton could read the discomfort in their eyes, could sense the unspoken concern that Reed had planted. "He is telling them the flour is tainted," Reva said one evening as they reviewed the day's thin receipts. "He is telling them that an orc handling the grain makes it unclean." "It is ridiculous," Dalton growled. "You never even touch the grain. It goes from their sacks to the hopper to the stones to the collection bags. The process is the same as any mill." "It does not matter if it is ridiculous," Reva said wearily. "People believe what they want to believe, and they want to believe that we are different, dangerous." Dalton wanted to argue, but he could not. He had seen the way some of the customers looked at Reva when they thought no one was watching, the suspicion, the unease, the naked prejudice. He had always known it existed, but having it directed at someone he loved made his blood boil. "We need to prove him wrong," Dalton said finally. "We need to show people that our flour is not just safe, but better." "How?" Reva asked. Dalton thought about it, turning possibilities over in his mind. Then an idea struck him, one that was risky but might just work. "The Harvest Festival," he said. "It is in 3 weeks. There is always a baking contest, and the winner gets a ribbon and town-wide bragging rights. What if we entered, used our own flour, showed everyone exactly what it can produce?" Reva looked skeptical. "You think a baking contest will change people's minds?" "Maybe not everyone's," Dalton admitted. "But if we win, it proves the flour is good. And if people see you there working openly, not hiding, it might make them think twice about the lies Reed is spreading." "Or it might make things worse," Reva said quietly. "It might," Dalton agreed. "But I would rather fight than watch our business die slowly because we were too afraid to stand up." Reva was quiet for a long moment, and then she nodded. "All right," she said. "We will do it. But I want to make the bread myself. If we are going to prove something, let me prove it." "You are a better baker than I am anyway," Dalton said with a smile, and she laughed, the sound lightening the tension in the room. The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. They continued to run the mill, though business remained slow. In the evenings, Reva experimented with bread recipes, trying different ratios of flour and water, different rising times, different baking temperatures. Dalton helped where he could, fetching ingredients, stoking the oven, offering opinions on taste and texture. What emerged from those experiments was a loaf that was genuinely exceptional, crusty on the outside, tender and airy on the inside, with a flavor that was rich and complex. Reva made the same loaf 3 times in a row to ensure she could replicate it consistently, and each time it came out perfect. "That will win," Dalton said confidently, tearing off a piece of the 3rd loaf and savoring it. "I have never tasted better." "It had better," Reva said, but there was a hint of pride in her voice that made Dalton smile. The day of the Harvest Festival dawned clear and cool, the kind of autumn day that made the valley look like something out of a painting. The festival was held in the town square, and by mid-morning it was packed with people browsing stalls, watching demonstrations, and sampling food. The baking contest was scheduled for early afternoon, and Dalton and Reva arrived with their loaf wrapped carefully in clean linen. The reaction when they signed up was immediate and unmistakable. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Dalton saw Tobias read across the square, and the look of malicious satisfaction on the man's face made his teeth grind. "Let them stare," Reva murmured, squaring her shoulders. "We are here. We are not hiding." The contest entries were set out on a long table for judging, and the judges' 3 respected bakers from the surrounding area made their way down the line, examining each loaf, smelling it, tasting a sample. Dalton watched them approach Reva's entry with his heart in his throat, aware of the crowd that had gathered to watch, aware of the whispers and the pointed looks. The head judge, a woman of 60 with flour permanently under her nails, cut a slice from Reva's loaf and examined it critically. She smelled it, studying the crumb structure. Then she took a bite, chewing slowly, and her expression went from professional assessment to genuine surprise. She turned to the other judges and said something too quiet for Dalton to hear, and they each took a sample as well. There was a long pause while they tasted and conferred, and Dalton felt Reva's hand slip into his, her grip tight with tension. Then the head judge stepped forward and raised her voice to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we have our winner. The finest bread I have tasted in 20 years of judging. This contest comes from Emrick's mill, baked by Reva Ruskin." The crowd erupted in a mix of applause and murmuring, and Dalton saw the shock on Reed's face turn to barely contained fury. The judge beckoned Reva forward, and she went stiffly as if expecting a trap. But when the judge handed her the blue ribbon and shook her hand, the gesture was genuine. "Exceptional work," the judge said warmly. "What is your secret?" "Good flour," Reva said simply, "and care." The judge smiled and turned back to the crowd. "Let this be a lesson," she announced. "Quality comes from skill and dedication, not from prejudice or rumor. This bread was made with flour from Emrick's mill, and it is the best I have ever tasted. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Dalton saw several people in the crowd look ashamed, while others nodded thoughtfully. Reed turned and stalked away, and Dalton felt a fierce surge of pride and triumph. They stayed at the festival for the rest of the day, and people approached them, some to offer congratulations, some to apologize for believing Reed's rumors, some simply to ask about bringing their grain to the mill again. By the time they headed home that evening, Dalton's pocket was full of promises of future business, and Reva was clutching her blue ribbon like a talisman. "We did it," she said wonderingly as they walked back to the mill under the stars. "We actually did it." "You did it," Dalton corrected, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "That bread was all you. The flour was all us," Reva replied, leaning into him. "Everything we built together." The next week, business rebounded dramatically. Farmers who had gone to Reed came back, some shamefaced and some defiant, but all of them with grain that needed milling. New customers arrived too, people from farther up the valley who had heard about the contest and wanted to try the flour that had produced such remarkable bread. Reed's mill, meanwhile, saw its business drop off. Word spread quickly in a small valley, and people had long memories for those who spread malicious rumors. Within 2 weeks, Reed was struggling, and within a month he approached Dalton with an offer to sell his mill and leave the valley entirely. "I will not pretend I am sorry to see you go," Dalton said when Reed came to finalize the sale, "but I will give you a fair price." "More than I deserve," Reed said bitterly. "I should not have done what I did. I was angry and afraid, and I let it turn me into someone I do not respect." "Then learn from it," Dalton said without sympathy, "and do better in the next place." With Reed gone and his mill purchased, Dalton and Reva found themselves with more business than they could handle from one mill alone. They hired 2 local men to run Reed's old mill under their supervision, and the operation expanded until they were milling grain for half the valley and parts of the neighboring regions as well. The work was demanding, but it was good work, honest work, and Dalton found a deep satisfaction in it. More than that, he found joy in coming home each evening to Reva, in sharing meals and stories and plans for the future. The drawer beside his bed was full now, and Reva's presence had spread through the house in 100 small ways, her cloak hanging by the door, her mending basket beside the fireplace, her laughter echoing through the rooms. Winter came, and with it a slowing of the milling work. The harvest was in, the grain stored, and the steady rush of autumn gave way to quieter days. Dalton and Reva spent the cold months making repairs, improving systems, and planning for the spring. They also spent long evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting together in comfortable silence. It was during one of those evenings, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling warmly, that Dalton brought up the subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "I want to marry you," he said, the words coming out more blunt than he had intended. Reva looked up from the shirt she was mending, her eyes wide. "What? I want to marry you," Dalton repeated, setting down his book and turning to face her fully. "I want to stand up in front of the whole valley and say that you are mine and I am yours. I want it to be official and legal and permanent." He took a breath. "If you will have me." Reva set down her mending with hands that trembled slightly. "People will talk," she said quietly. "A human marrying an orc, it is not common." "I do not care what people say," Dalton said firmly. "I care about you. I care about building a life together, a real life, with all the legitimacy and commitment that entails." He reached for her hand. "We have already proven that we can face down prejudice and come out stronger. Let us prove that we can build something lasting too." Reva was quiet for a long moment, and Dalton felt his heart hammering in his chest as he waited for her answer. Then she smiled, bright and joyful and utterly beautiful, and nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They kissed there by the fire, and Dalton felt a happiness so profound it was almost painful. This was not the life he had imagined when he was young, when he had married his first wife and dreamed of children and growing old in the house they had shared. But it was a good life, a life he had chosen and built with his own hands, and he would not trade it for anything. They were married in the spring, in a small ceremony at the town church, with the priest looking faintly scandalized but performing the rites nonetheless. Half the valley turned out to watch, some out of genuine goodwill and some out of curiosity, but Dalton did not care. He stood at the altar and took Reva's hand and spoke his vows with a steady voice, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, he kissed her thoroughly enough to make several of the older women in the congregation gasp. The celebration afterward was held at the mill, and people brought food and drink and music. They danced in the yard as the sun set, and Dalton held Reva in his arms and thought that he had never been happier. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, an older woman approached them, one of the farmers' wives who had been cool to Reva when she first arrived, but who had thawed considerably after the baking contest. "I owe you an apology," the woman said to Reva, her voice stiff but sincere. "I believed the rumors about you without question. I should have known better. You are a good woman, and I am glad you are part of this valley now." "Thank you," Reva said, and Dalton could hear the emotion in her voice. "That means a great deal." Other apologies followed, some awkward and some heartfelt, and by the time the last guest left, Dalton and Reva were alone under the stars, the mill quiet behind them. "Are you happy?" Dalton asked, pulling her close. "I did not know I could be this happy," Reva admitted, resting her head against his chest. I spent so many years alone, thinking that was all I would ever have. And now I have you and this place and a life I never imagined." "We built it together," Dalton said, echoing her words from months before. "And we will keep building it, together." The years that followed were good ones. The mills prospered, and Dalton and Reva's reputation for quality and honesty spread far beyond the valley. They hired more workers, expanded their operations, and became pillars of the community in a way that would have seemed impossible when Reva first arrived looking for work. But the greatest change came in the form of a letter that arrived one summer afternoon, written in a careful hand that Dalton recognized immediately. It was from his daughter, now 16 and nearly grown, asking if she could come to visit. Dalton read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking, before showing it to Reva. "She wants to meet you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She says she wants to know her father, and she wants to meet the woman who made him write such different letters than he used to." "What do you mean?" Reva asked, reading over his shoulder. "I have been writing to her more," Dalton admitted, "since we got married, telling her about the mill, about you, about our life here. I suppose it showed." "And you want her to come?" Reva asked carefully. "More than anything," Dalton said. "But only if you are comfortable with it." Reva smiled and kissed his cheek. "She is your daughter," she said simply. "Of course she should come." The daughter, whose name was Miranda, arrived 3 weeks later, a tall girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's serious eyes. She was shy at first, uncertain how to bridge the gap of years and distance, but Reva's gentle warmth and Dalton's obvious joy at seeing her again slowly drew her out. They spent 2 weeks together, and Dalton watched his daughter discover the valley and the mill and the life he had built. She helped with the work, learning to mill grain and bake bread, and she and Reva developed an easy rapport that made Dalton's heart swell. On her last evening before returning to the coast, Miranda sat with Dalton and Reva on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I am glad you found each other," she said quietly. "You seem happy, father, happier than I remember." "I am," Dalton said, reaching for Reva's hand. "I am very happy." "And I am glad I came," Miranda continued. "I would like to come back if that is all right, maybe for longer next time." "You are always welcome," Reva said warmly. "This is your home too, whenever you want it to be." Miranda smiled and leaned against her father's shoulder, and Dalton felt a sense of peace settle over him that was complete and whole. 2 years after their marriage, Reva told Dalton she was pregnant. The news sent him into a state of nervous excitement that made her laugh. He fussed over her constantly, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard, until she finally took his face in her hands and told him firmly that she was not fragile and would not be treated as if she were. "I am an orc," she said with amusement. "We are built sturdy. The baby and I will be fine." But Dalton could not help worrying, could not help remembering his first wife and the fever that had taken her after their daughter's birth. He tried to hide his fear, but Reva saw it anyway and was patient with him, letting him hover and fret because she understood where it came from. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and when the time came for the birth, Dalton paced outside the bedroom while the midwife attended to Reva within. The hours stretched endlessly, and he thought he might go mad from the waiting and the fear. Then the door opened and the midwife emerged, smiling. "You have a son," she said, "strong and healthy, and your wife is doing very well." Dalton rushed past her into the room and found Reva propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, cradling a small bundle in her arms. She looked up at him and smiled. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Dalton approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the baby. He was tiny and wrinkled, with a dusting of dark hair and skin that was a soft greenish tan, somewhere between Reva's and Dalton's own. His eyes were closed and his small mouth worked in sleep. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The fingers curled around his own, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "What should we name him?" Reva asked. They had discussed names endlessly over the previous months, debating and discarding dozens of options. But now, looking at his son, Dalton knew exactly what felt right. "Darren," he said. "Dalton Emrick, after my father." "Darren," Reva repeated, testing the name. Then she smiled. "I like it. Hello, Darren. Welcome to the world." Darren grew quickly, a bright and curious child who had his mother's determination and his father's careful precision. He learned to walk in the mill, toddling between the sacks of grain and laughing at the sound of the water wheel. He learned to talk by asking endless questions about how things worked, and Dalton delighted in answering them, in teaching his son the trade that had been his own father's and grandfather's before him. When Darren was 2, Miranda came to visit again and stayed for a month, helping with the mill and doting on her half-brother. The sight of them playing together, Miranda's patient kindness and Darren's delighted giggles, made Dalton feel like his family had finally become whole after being fractured for so long. "You should think about moving here permanently," Reva suggested to Miranda one evening. "Your father would love to have you close, and there is more than enough work." Miranda looked tempted, but she shook her head. "I have a life on the coast," she said, "and I am courting someone there, but I promise I will visit more often. And when I have children of my own, they will know their grandfather and their aunt and their cousin." It was enough, Dalton thought. More than enough. His children knew each other, cared for each other, and that was a gift he had not expected to receive. The seasons turned, and the mill continued to thrive. Dalton taught Darren the trade as he grew older, showing him how to adjust the stones and maintain the gears and judge the quality of the flour by touch and taste. Darren took to it naturally, and Dalton saw in his son the same satisfaction in good work well done that he himself had always felt. Reva, meanwhile, expanded her baking, selling bread and pastries at the weekly market and building a reputation that rivaled the mill's own. People came from neighboring valleys to buy her goods, and she trained 2 young apprentices to help with the increased demand. Together, they built something that was more than just a business. They built a legacy, a home, a community. The mill became a gathering place, a landmark, a symbol of what could be built when people chose to work together instead of tearing each other down. And through it all, Dalton and Reva remained the steady heart of it, working side by side as they had from the beginning, partners in every sense of the word. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Reva back to the spot where they had first cleared the mill race together, where the whole rebuilding had begun. The stream ran clear and strong now, feeding the water wheel that turned without pause, and the sound of the mill working was a constant background music to their lives. "You remember the first day you came here?" Dalton asked, taking her hand. "When you stood in the doorway and expected me to turn you away." "I remember," Reva said, squeezing his fingers. "I remember thinking you would be like all the others, but you were not." "I needed help," Dalton said simply. "And you were the only one who offered it honestly without trying to take advantage of my desperation." He turned to face her fully. "You saved more than my mill, Reva. You saved me. You gave me a reason to build instead of just survive." "We saved each other," Reva replied, her eyes bright. "I was so tired of being alone, of moving from place to place with no home and no hope. And then I found you, and you gave me both." They stood there together in the autumn sunlight, beside the stream that had brought them together and the mill that had given them purpose. And Dalton thought about the long road that had led them to this moment. He thought about loss and grief and the slow rebuilding of a shattered life. He thought about the courage it had taken for Reva to keep knocking on doors that kept closing in her face, and the courage it had taken for him to open one of those doors and let her in. Most of all, he thought about the simple truth that had underpinned everything they had built together. That honest work, honestly done, was its own reward. And that love, when it was real and true and tested by time, could grow into something stronger than stone and more enduring than iron. "Come on," Reva said, tugging his hand with a smile. "Darren will be wondering where we went, and I have a cake baking that needs to come out of the oven." They walked back to the mill together, hand in hand, and the water wheel turned behind them in its endless patient rhythm, grinding grain into flour, turning raw material into sustenance, doing the work it was built to do. Inside, Darren was carefully sweeping flour from the floor, his small face serious with concentration. He looked up when they entered and grinned, showing the gap where he had lost a tooth the week before. "Mother, the timer went off," he announced proudly. "I turned down the oven like you showed me." "Good boy," Reva said, moving to check the cake. It had risen perfectly, golden and fragrant, and she set it on the cooling rack with practiced ease. Dalton watched his wife and son moving around the kitchen, watched the comfortable dance of people who knew each other's rhythms, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. This was what happiness looked like, he thought. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the ordinary magic of family and home and work that mattered. That evening they ate the anniversary cake together. The three of them crowded around the table in the warm lamplight, and Dalton told stories about the mill's history, while Darren listened with wide eyes and Reva interjected corrections with fond exasperation. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and inside, the fire burned steady and bright. Later, after Darren had been put to bed and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Dalton and Reva sat together on the porch and looked out at the valley that had become their home. The mill was a dark shape against the stars, and the sound of the water was a constant gentle music. 10 years, Reva said softly. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Dalton replied, his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes I still cannot believe you stayed. That you chose this life chose me." "It was the easiest choice I ever made," Reva said, leaning into him. "You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me work when no one else would. You gave me love when I thought I was unlovable." She tilted her face up to kiss him. "How could I not stay?" "I am glad you did," Dalton said, and the words felt inadequate to express the depth of his gratitude, his love, his bone-deep certainty that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, and Dalton thought about the future that stretched before them. There would be more challenges, he knew. More seasons of flood and drought, more prejudice to face down, more work to do. But they would face it all together, as they had from the beginning, and that made all the difference. Eventually the cold drove them inside, and they banked the fire and climbed the stairs to their bedroom. The drawer beside the bed, the one Dalton had cleared all those years ago, as an offer of permanence, was still full of Reva's things, a quiet testament to the promise he had made and kept. As they settled into bed together, warm under the quilts that Reva had made from scraps of fabric accumulated over the years, Dalton felt a sense of completion that was rare and precious. His life had been broken once, shattered by loss and grief, but he had rebuilt it into something new and strong and good, and he had not done it alone. "I love you," he murmured into the darkness, and Reva's hand found his beneath the blankets. "I love you too," she replied, her voice thick with sleep. "Always." Dalton closed his eyes and let himself drift, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more of the ordinary miracles that made up a life well lived. The mill would keep turning, the flour would keep flowing, and he and Reva would keep building the future together, one day at a time. Outside, the water wheel turned in the darkness, patient and inexorable, doing the work it was made for. And inside, in the warmth and safety of their home, Dalton and Reva slept, partners and lovers and friends, bound together by choice and commitment, and the deep abiding love that had grown from honest work and mutual respect into something that would last all their days. The orc woman had come looking for honest work, and the man had quietly cleared a drawer beside his bed. And from that simple beginning had grown a life richer than either of them had dared to dream. It was not a fairy tale, not a grand romance for the ages, but something better and more true, a partnership built on solid ground, tested by time and proven strong enough to weather any storm. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.